Good evening, and thanks for joining us again. Today's webinar will be presented by Dr. Saúl MANZANO-RODRÍguEZ with the title Arid and Biodiverse, a long-term perspective of how landscapes overcome aridity. Dr. Saúl Manzano is a postdoctoral fellow in climate change and conservation biology from the Plant Conservation Unit in the University of Cape Town. He's going to explain to us the long-term plant survival into constructing in highly biodiverse environments in the south of Spain, the coastal Doñana marshlands and the high Sierra Nevada range. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
So after this short video from our ambassador in South Africa, Dr. Manzano-RODRÍguEZ, he's a postdoc at the Plant Conservation Unit at the University of Cape Town. He comes from Spain and studied biology at the Complutense University of Madrid, and then he specialized in botany. He is a paleoecologist, and he's interested in the long-term dynamics of biodiversity hotspots. His research focuses on the use of multi-proxies to reconstruct environmental and biodiversity dynamics in order to detect ecosystem responses to environmental changes. And currently at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, his research focuses on Quaternary biome transitions at the Western Cape fynbos rhinostervale succulent karoo boundary. His research has a goal to provide paleoecological information applicable in the projection of future environmental change scenarios under the current paradigm of global change. So with this short information about Saúl Manzano, I will hand in to him, to our speaker today, so that he can start the presentation. And if you have any questions, please type them in the QA box. And then after the presentation, we will have some time for questions and answers. So Saúl, the floor is yours. You can start sharing your screen, and we are happy to listen to you. Do we have you there, Saúl?
Yes, just sorting some IT.
Okay, fantastic. We can see the presentation. So go ahead.
Hello, everybody, and good evening. After like these very good presentations, I don't think I should say much more about myself, but especially because the Spanish part is evident from my accent. But other than that, I'm a botanist, and I'm a botanist by background, but also by heart. Most of my life has been in between plants. So when I had to choose a career path, probably I didn't choose the best spade or the one that would make me famous, but I did choose the one that made me passionate about. So I studied plants. And my tool to study plants is pollen grains. Pollen grains are extremely diverse. And if you look at this picture, you can see that they have different sizes and shapes, and that tell us which plant they come from. This is very interesting, especially because as allergic people know, they are produced in enormous quantities. So we've got something that's produced in enormous quantities that we can trace back to the source. Furthermore, the wall of the pollen grain is made by spore pollenin, a sort of plastic, natural plastic that doesn't degrade. We recover fossil pollen spores from 400 million years ago, where the spore pollen is intact. The consequences of this is that pollen grains are going to accumulate in places where sediments accumulate naturally, for example, in lakes, and from there we can recover them. There's also other kinds of deposits, such as peatlands, which are wetlands that produce organic matter that grows on top of each other, and as the sediment accumulates, it accumulates pollen grains. This is a very young me coring a peatland. And what we recover from the sediments is a sausage that goes from the younger and upper part to the older and deeper part, from which we extract the pollen grains and count them. And we count for hours and hours and hours. And when you've counted about 100,000 pollen grains, what you have is a depiction of how the abundance of pollen grains changes through time. If we look at this slide, the older sediments, so the bottom part has different pollen grains than the top part. So we can track, because we know which plants produce the pollen, how the changes in the pollen abundance varies through time, and also this is an indication of how those plants vary through time. And this is extremely interesting because we can know the vegetation history of a determinate site just by looking at the pollen grains that are trapped in the sediments. We use different techniques to integrate this vegetation history within paleoclimatological and sedimentological proxies. So what we reconstruct is a paleoecological narrative, so the history of the landscape in terms of climate and vegetation. You might have heard of radiocarbon dating, which we use to know how old is the sediment, so when do changes in the vegetation happen. There are other techniques that are depicted here that will tell us if the climate was wetter or was drier, if there were storms and erosive processes, and these kind of things. The problem is that normally we would try to recover pollen grains from places that are inundated because water protects the deposits from being eroded. It's like a protective blanket. But as we move into drier areas, such as in South Africa or in southern Spain, deposits become more difficult to find. Sometimes they're just badly preserved, for example, these flays in Namibia, or sometimes they're just non-existent. So as things get drier, we have to get creative, and we look for pollen in the most unexpected places. For example, we track dassies to see where they sleep and actually where they poo. Dassies are very romantic animals, and every morning and every evening, they would look at the rising or setting sun and do their own things. And they choose these sites, usually in cliff overhangs, for thousands of years. So their poo accumulates in these middens for thousands of years. The midden in the left is 60,000 years. That's 60,000 years worth of dassy excrements that trap the pollen. And from there we can also recover pollen. It's quite impressive how these little animals can help us reconstructing the story of our landscapes. And this is extremely important because arid areas are a very important fraction of the emerged land masses. You can see in this picture how most of the earth is actually dry. And I would say also the most interesting places are dry places. Especially because the world's biodiversity hotspots, so the most biodiverse environments in the world, are usually centered around arid areas. This is the case, for example, of the Mediterranean Basin. So if you look at the Mediterranean Basin, it's quite dry overall. There is mountains and there is some lowlands that are wetter, especially towards the north. But again, the Mediterranean Basin is unevenly hot as a hotspot. And if we look at the top picture, we can see the hotter spots within the hotspot, which don't match the most green areas in the lower picture. So today, I'm going to speak about these two hotspots into finer detail, these two red spots that are there, which are two national parks in Spain. And they are important because they give a very good insight on how arid landscapes can overcome aridity through time. Remember the drought in Cape Town and how it could have driven extremely big social changes and even social collapses. Obviously, we are not there in that point on the right. This is an old slide, shame on me. On the one hand, the Doñana National Park, it's a huge marshland that lies by the coast at the mouth of one of the biggest Spanish rivers. The marshland is separated from the sea by an immense dune field, where the vegetation is mainly distributed according to the height of the dunes and how far the roots of the plant can get into the aquifer that underlies the dunes. The dunes, some of them are mobile and they would bury the vegetation. Some vegetation, like the pines to the left and green, die when they are buried by the dunes, but other trees can ride the dunes, like the juniper to the right. In stabilized sand, we find the famous cotos, which have also deep cultural significance in southern Spain, where cork oaks, as the one we can find planted all around Cape Town and in some places in Table Mountain, grow. It is an extremely beautiful landscape, but it is much more diverse than it is beautiful. As you can see in this picture, it is not a densely populated landscape. There is openings to it, but the number of bushes and trees we can find is immense. We find landscapes that are extremely rich in shrubs, like our famous here in South Africa. We call them Monte Blanco and Monte Negro, according to their composition, which is not really relevant at the moment, but we can discuss that. And the most important feature of this landscape is that it is full of wetlands, of different types, such as ephemeral wetlands, shallow wetlands, wetlands that feed from the dune aquifer, so the dunes have water inside and they discharge. There is seasonal ponds that dry completely, and there is permanent ponds with an extremely rich aquatic flora. About 80% of the aquatic plants in Europe live in these environments, in southern Spain, one of the most arid places. Some of them are of extreme value in terms of conservation because they are the southernmost populations of the species, and sometimes they are so restricted that the survival of this population would be key for their persistence in time. So the dunes that separate the marshland from the sea have an ecotone, so that's a transitional zone that doesn't look very interesting because it's just grasslands, but they give way to the biggest and most extensive marshland in Europe, about 40,000 hectares of pristine marshland of an original total extent of 140,000 hectares of marshlands cover the biggest part of the national park, with again a very rich and diverse flora. And probably my biggest challenge today is to convince you that these extremely diverse aquatic environments, for most of the time, it looks like this, because the marshlands at the mouth of the River Guadalquivir are seasonal and dry every year. How can it be that one of the most diverse environments in terms of aquatic plants dries out every year? Now let's move to the other national park. The Sierra Nevada National Park is absolutely different. We were speaking of coastal environments. Now we're going to speak about the highest mountain range in the country, which is not the Pyrenees, it's actually the kilometers from the coast. And it reaches altitudes of 3,480 meters at its summit. Some years in summer, it maintains snows. There is a geobotanical principle that says that the changes that we can observe in latitude can also be mirrored in altitude as we climb the mountains. So traveling up the Sierra Nevada mountain range is like traveling from Northern Africa to Southern Norway in terms of vegetation change. We've got from desertic scrubs to evergreen sclerophyllous forests, so typically Mediterranean vegetation, sometimes intersped with very particular lithologies like these Dolomies. This is a type of rock that is rich in magnesium, which is toxic for plant, but still has a very interesting and specific vegetation. This is another image of this. We also find deciduous forest like we would find in central France, but here in southern Spain, only just above the Mediterranean vegetation. This is the beautiful colors they show us in autumn when all the leaves are about to fall. There is also pinelands like we would find in southern northern countries of Europe. Small scrubs, sometimes with plants that are absolutely exclusive because they are plants of Mediterranean affinity that have adapted to the high mountains. This is very interesting vegetation because actually these plants smell like garlic. So when you walk amongst them, then you come down to your house and you smell like garlic bread. It's quite cool. And then these mountains are so high that they held glaciers in the last glacial maximum. And those glaciers now have left lakes and sort of alpine meadows that we would only find in the tundras near the polar circle. And it is this these vegetation elements, they are the most interesting ones. We've got plants that are of endemic genuses. Nevadensia, which refers to Sierra Nevada, it's a genus with one species that only exists there. Look at these plants, they are tiny, they form mats. They are like little at-breast, cushion-like things that live amongst rock. We really need to look very carefully to see them. These flowers are not more than 3 millimeters in size. Here's another example. Well, all this accumulation of life in southern Spain has typically been attributed to changes in big changes in climate, especially to the last glacial maximum. So what the general theory has always said is that, well, the northern hemisphere actually froze almost completely in the higher latitudes, but then plants survived in the south. You can see the picture in the left where the polar latitudes are absolutely covered in ice, whereas earlier this morning the world didn't look like that. And it is true that if we look at the places where we've got fossils dating back 26,000 years, which is, I mean, from a geological point of view, yesterday, if we look at the places where the plants actually refuged, and then we compare them with the biodiversity hotspots, they do match quite well. So yes, probably there is an enormous importance of glacial dynamics to explain why those diverse environments are diverse. However, the last glacial maximum ended at least 20,000 years ago. For the last 11,700 years, the geological period we know as the Holocene, the climate has been much different. It's warmed up, it's become drier, and if we look at the scientific literature that treats this period, the main idea we get is that the Holocene is a period of intensified aridity. So during the last 11,000 years, the northern hemisphere, particularly the Mediterranean, has been becoming drier and drier every year, with fluctuations, of course, but drier and drier. There is an overarching aridity trend that has been underpinning the vegetation dynamics in the Mediterranean for the last 11,000 years. Well, maybe not so much, but the last 7,000 for sure. So, of course, plant life accumulated during the last glacial. The southern Europe was like a holiday for them. There was no ice, weather was nice. However, if they're still there, it's because they survived the last 11,000 years. So there is a component of accumulation, but there is a component of survival. So how these plants, some of which are typically Central European plants or aquatic plants, survived aridity for thousands of years, this is very interesting to understand how we can manage them and how we can treat these environments to conserve and preserve our diversity. So what we did is we recovered fossil sequences, pollen sequences from both national parks. For example, in Doñana, we took sediments from these environments and produced these diagrams, which are extremely user-unfriendly. Actually, not even paleopalynologists like them. But we've never found any other or better way to depict our data. It's a shame. I promise there is almost 250,000 pollen grains counted to construct this, and it doesn't even look pretty. So what I've done is I've selected some of the important taxa, and then I've brought nice pictures, which is always nice. So for example, what happens in Doñana when aridity hits? Well, what happens is, remember, this is a dune-prone landscape that is already quite an arid, it's like a desert, really. So when aridity hits, plants die, and dunes start moving again because plants trap the dunes. So the dunes start moving, they become higher. And we know that this happens because there is plants that will tell us about high dunes. For example, that plant in the middle picture, that's a juniper. You will all probably know juniper from drinking gin and tonic. Gin comes from the essence of junipers. Not particularly that one because it's abortive, but other junipers. Well, when we find pollen of juniper trees, that means that the dunes are higher. And what happens when the dunes are higher? We see, if we look at the point of the yellow lines in the upper picture on the slide, that the aquatic plants also grow when there is juniper peaks. It's all parallel. And how is that possible if we are speaking of moments when aridity hits? Well, the dunes move, but the dunes, the sand leaves spaces in between the grains, and those spaces can be filled with water. So when the dunes grow, the aquifer that underlies the dunes becomes bigger. So the discharges to the lower parts are also bigger. If you look at this picture, you can see in the front of the picture a pine, and you can hardly see the trunk. That pine is being buried. However, if you look behind the pine, that is a dried wetland, because the dunes, which you can see in the background, are higher and discharging water. At the same time, they bury the pines, which means that higher dunes mean more discharges of water. So there is like a mechanism of compensation there. Here you can see how it mirrors in the course, but this is just so user unfriendly, but I would not be a proper scientist if I didn't use ugly pictures sometimes. Here you can see how the dunes, which are very big, at their base, they have water springs. Why? Because the aquifer in the dunes discharges. And if we measure the volume of the aquifer, it mirrors quite well the sizes and shapes of the dunes in Doñana. And this is quite interesting, and it had never seen before. We had never seen something like that. So dry periods, more dunes, but then more water. It's quite cool. We know that these dynamics of dunes that have been moved and have buried the landscapes has been going on in the place for thousands of years, at least 65,000 years. We find that in this cliff, in one of the best beaches of Spain, this is not sponsored by the Department of Tourism, just as a note, you see a line in the cliff, that's a black line, that is a wetland that was on top of the dunes and that was buried by an incoming dune 60,000 years ago. So we've got that these dynamics have been going on in the place for 65,000 years. What happens here is that as dunes move, they leave hollows and they discharge water. So the wetlands are buried and the plants die when the wetlands are buried, of course, but then they can jump from one another because the dispersion of plants is quicker than the movement of the dunes. We know that when dunes become higher, also they produce water. This is not just inference from the fossil record, because when we've tried to, this is an example from a restoration project in the eastern coast of Spain, when they tried to restore the dune field that was absolutely destroyed to build an illegal, well, that was, part of it was a military field and part of it was an illegal development. So they installed these screens, these plant screens that are traditionally called bardisas. The following summer, there were wetlands there. And now these wetlands fill every year, and sometimes they fill for so long that they are not even seasonal. They last all year long. So we know, and we've got evidence that that has happened naturally, that higher dunes means water. And this is extremely interesting in dry places. Now, what happens in Sierra Nevada? In Sierra Nevada, we took cores from the sediment that was in a lake. And we did that from a boat that you can see on the left, bottom left picture. Again, we produce a very unfriendly diagram, and this time my pictures are better. But first, let me introduce you the main characters here. So we've got pines that are the trees that reach the highest altitude in the mountain. They constitute what we call the tree line. And the tree line, so the highest trees in the mountain, can fluctuate with climate fluctuations. Then we've got the deciduous, so the trees that shed the leaf, quercus, so the oaks, and mesophytes, so the typical broadleaf forest that live just below them. Well, and below, we've got the pollen diagram. Then there is another extremely important actor in this, the history of this landscape, which is we call them cryoxerophilous pastures. So when there is these very big scientific words, the best thing is to read them backwards. So philos means friend, xero means dry, cryo means cold. So plants that are friends of dry and cold places, essentially plants that live on top of mountains. Well, these plants that live on top of mountains that form these extremely compact aggregates and mats that carpet the high summits are extremely interesting. And they are one of the elements that controls what happens in the whole mountain, and we'll see why. During a humid period, the tree line, which is restricted not only by temperature, but also by effective humidity, so how much water there is, ascends. And then the permanent snows, because it's humid, it snows more, descends, which means that these pastures are eaten from the bottom and from the top. So the space they can cover is very small. And mostly water runs off the sides of the mountain. You can see in the bottom diagram how the white lines point peaks of pines in dark green, and they reflect, they have this seesaw dynamics with the pink, which is the mat forming pastures. But what happens when aridity hits? And we know that aridity hits. It's exactly the opposite. So there will be less permanent snows because there is less rain and less snowfall. The tree line will descend because there will be not enough water to compensate for the cold in the higher summits. And then these pastures that are friends of the cold and of the dry areas will expand. But what happens with these pastures? Well, these pastures, they intercept running water. Imagine you drop water in your house and you drop it on tiles, it will run very quickly. But imagine you drop water on a carpet. What will happen? It will not run, but rather infiltrate to the depths of the carpet. Well, this is actually what happens in these environments. When these pastures develop more, there is more infiltration. And what happens with that infiltration? It recharges the aquifers inside of the mountain, and that water is discharged to the bottom parts where these water-loving mesophytes, we call so plants that like temperate environments, the broadleaf forest live. If you look at the things that live in the top of the mountain, so the pink curve and the green curve, there's this seesaw dynamics. But if we look at the mesophytes, so in light green, they're quite stable through time, which means that aridity doesn't hit them. Why? Because when it's humid, it's good for everybody. Like it's a moment of abundance. But when things get tough, because there is extra seepage and infiltration and aquifer recharge, they still get the water they need. So there is, again, mechanisms of compensation of aridity in an arid landscape, which is, again, extremely interesting. And once again, we've got a ground truthing of this from a traditional practice. So these mountains is in the south, just 40 kilometers from the coast, as I said, and it's got at its foothill the city of Granada. The city of Granada is a city that's been sitting there for more than 2,000 years. It was Roman, then it was Arab. Again, I'm not sponsored by the tourism department, but it's a must visit. And the people of the city of Granada and of the surrounding area called the Alpujarras have lived from the mountain for thousands of years as well. Especially in the last 100 years, they developed a system of altitude pastures. So they would take their goats mostly and sheep to graze on the mountains. And to do that, they would water the mountain by creating these channels that you can see in the bottom pictures and flooding the veld. Then they would get better pastures. This system of channels is called acequias, and we call them acequias de careos in this area. So you can see here how there is areas that are greener, and that is where the acequias are flooded into the fields. What happens with this system is that as these acequias are let loose on the mountain slope, which is quite devoid of vegetation, because this is extremely high, we would never find trees this high, they recharge the aquifer in the mountains. This practice is a practice that disappeared in the 50s with the well, one of the last rural exodus in Spain. And as this practice disappeared, because it requires a lot of hard labor, many of the fountains of the villages at the foothills of the Sierra Nevada dried. This is happening in Spain in a moment where most villages in this kind of rural mountainous areas still didn't have running water. So this is how we know that infiltration in the higher stances of the Sierra Nevada is extremely important for discharges in the lower Sierra Nevada, which is where we source our water from. So if we go of an overview of these two arid landscapes, there is different factors and landscape components that control the survival of taxa, of life. In the case of Sierra Nevada, it's a biotic component. It is these pastures, these small pastures that are friends of the cold and the dry areas, so the top of the mountains. In the case of Doñana, it is the size and shape of the dunes that control the size of the aquifer and then how much water they can store and ultimately how much water can be discharged. So probably if we research each and every of these Mediterranean biodiversity hotspots, and we've got some research done in the Tyrrhenian Islands in Corsica and Sardinia, we would find that at small scale there is aridity compensation mechanisms that are not only important to plan conservation management actions, but also to ensure the provision of an essential ecosystem service, which is water. I know that speaking from Cape Town, it might seem redundant to explain the importance of water, but it is the essential ecosystem source that we are running out of in Mediterranean environments. Mediterranean as in not only around the Mediterranean basin, but also winter rainfall environments, of which there are 5 in the world: the Mediterranean Basin, us here in Cape Town, Central Chile, Western Australia, and California, all heavily populated, all extremely biodiverse, all running out of water. So if we look at these hotspots, it's probable that all the arid ones also have this kind of mechanisms. And that is exactly what we're trying to research from the plant conservation unit, from my research group. So for example, if we think of the boundary of the Albany thickets and the fynbos, this is the Sanders River mouth of Port Elizabeth. It's a very similar environment to Doñana. You can see through the reflection, there are some little lakes in between the dunes. This is an extremely biodiverse environment. This is one of the easternmost stations of the fynbos biome. And here, in the very mouth of the river, there is wetlands, well, fossil wetlands. If you look at the bottom picture, and again, I mean, this is almost a leap of faith for you to believe that that is a wetland. There is wetland sediments that now at this moment are sitting in our lab to be examined to see if we can extract pollen from them and try to reconstruct the dynamics of those dunes, and if they also can enhance the provision of water if the size and shape changes. This is extremely important in an arid environment, as is the Eastern Cape. Another of our project, much closer, is in the Glacial Nature Reserve, very near Montague, and between Toosrivier and Montague, where the succulent karoo, the fynbos, and Renosterfeld have a very particular altitudinal disposition, and it is probable that what happens in the fynbos is mirrored in the Renosterfeld and the succulent karoo, because there is also infiltration mediation processes in water discharge and so recharge of aquifers in the top of the mountains and discharge in the lower stances. And this is exactly the project I'm trying to develop now. So if you look here, it's probably difficult to find a wetland. And what you probably pick up as a wetland is actually a dam. That is the wetland that we've cored. And you can see that the mountain has almost nothing there, the top of the mountain. It's because fynbos is a fire-prone environment and it's burned recently. And what we want to see is, how does the presence of fynbos affect the development of the wetland? Because imagine that we are burning fynbos in the top of the mountains, and then the water is not being stopped by the carpet of vegetation and into the aquifer, but rather is running off. We might be actually starving ourselves of water just by not doing a careful management of fire, which is a prime conservation question almost in every Mediterranean environment. there is also other places that are extremely interesting and that we want to study for, like further along the line to answer these kind of questions. And this is just on the very edge of the escarpment, very near Van Reinsdorp. This is the aspect of the vegetation, again, mud forming, quite intricate. And here we find this sort of milky ponds. These wetlands are chemical depressions that have been filled with sediment, and they lie in the heart of one of the rooibos producing regions. So it might be very interesting to take course there and see how climate change affects the vegetation and ultimately how those factors interplay with the provision of water to the lower areas of this landscape, which is where the rooibos plantations are situated. These rooibos plantations are the only source of livelihoods for people that don't have much to live in. And sometimes the questions to understand the present and to project for the future have to be solved in the past. Because if we look very near these environments, the desert is just on the brink of this area. This is 20 kilometers inland. And it is these kind of questions that relate the past, the present, and the future of our land management that the Plant Conservation Unit, of which I am a very proud member since the start of, well, the early 2019, tries to answer. We study the history of landscapes to understand how they are configured in the present and to link them to future actions, not only to understand the environment, but also our relationship with it. Thank you very much. That's all on my side, and I would love to answer any of your questions now.
Well, thank you very much, Saúl. This was a very interesting presentation. I would suggest you keep your presentation a nice picture or something like this, so that if you need to scroll through your presentation.
Oh, perfect. I can do that.
So,
certainly do that.
And indeed, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand or you can type your questions into the Q&A box. So right now, I cannot see any question, but I have a question.
Brilliant.
Have all the studies that that has been done, for example, these ones in the Plant Conservation Unit, have they been taken into account by South African authorities, or do they normally take into account this type of studies in order to make new laws, to think about next steps or something like this?
So that is the actual, the very up-to-date challenge of our lab, is to work with the authorities into conservation management. So there has been a lot of input from paleo data into the savanna biome, and now the fynbos biome is starting to develop this kind of study. So we don't have a lot of data. We've got data on Renosterfeld baseline, so which moment in time should we aim to restore Renosterfeld? So what should Renosterfeld look like? And this has been done by Sherry Forrest, which is one of our PhD students at the moment. But there is not a lot yet. We try to work both in private nature reserves, which are usually easier to access in terms of permits, and national parks. Now we are conducting, well, not fieldwork because it's not allowed due to the lockdown, but we are in conversation with Table Mountain National Park to work there. But we will try. That's the aim of the lab. The mission of the lab is to incorporate long-term ecological data into future landscape management.
Yeah, that sounds great. So thank you very much for the answer. Any questions from the audience? If not, I have also a comment, another question. I presume coming here to South Africa, it needs to be like a dream for a botanist and more to the Western Cape. And for how long are you going to stay here? What are your future steps?
Well, that's quite uncertain. So the first time I came to South Africa, I actually didn't came to the Western Cape. I came probably to the botanical, in botanical terms, the most uninteresting place, which was Bloemfontein. Not that Bloemfontein is uninteresting overall, it is not, but yeah, it is a dream. it is an actual dream. It's the hottest biodiversity, the hottest temperate biodiversity hotspot. Well, at this moment, I want to stay here. My contract will only end at the end of 2021, and hopefully I can renew for more, because there is so much to be done and it's so pleasant to work here. I've got a very privileged working environment and personal environment as well.
That sounds nice. I'm glad about that. Any questions from the audience? You are a bit quiet this evening. So, Saúl, and do you keep connections with your working groups in Spain? Have you connect your plant conservation unit in South Africa with your colleagues in Spain, or?
Well, my working group in Spain ceased to exist due to retirements and ends of contracts, but we are in touch. Like the palynological community is very small, I'd say, in the world, and we all know each other, and of course we work together because there's not so much people, and there is a lot of sharing of ideas that always goes on between the people that work in winter rainfall areas, because it's, again, very limited. Within the world, the 5 Mediterranean climate areas are small, and the palynological community, so my discipline, is small as well. So we do all, and we're all like a bunch of nice people, I'd say. Most of us, at least.
That sounds nice. So I cannot see any question. Let's see. There we have a raised hand. So Pachi Cervantes, you are allowed to talk now. You need to unmute yourself.
Hi. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi. Thanks, Saúl. Great talk. Very interesting. I've been battling with my connection a little bit, so I might have missed a few important points. So I have a question that might be a bit complicated to answer. So if I've understood correctly, the dry areas, the arid areas, tend to be quite diverse, for what I take. Do you think that is a trend that is likely to keep like that, to stay like that? Do you think that that's going to change in the future for or by the action of human populations or actions?
That's a very good question, and indeed it's very complicated. So arid areas tend to be diverse because when there is not a lot of water, there is some features of the landscape that are revealed, to say somehow. So for example, lithologies with complicated elements or toxic elements, usually when there is a lot of water, they are washed down. So the vegetation that can install on top of it, it's quite mainstream. It's plants that don't have very specific requirements. When this doesn't happen in arid environments, there is a lot of selective pressures that drive the diversification of floras typically. Unfortunately, many of the very arid areas in the world, and arid and biodiverse, are extremely heavily populated, and we compete for the key resource, which is water. I was very astonished when I moved to Cape Town that people say, "Oh, it's fine because if it doesn't rain, we just do boreholes." If you think of that in Spain, voy a hacer un pozo, which means I'm going to do a borehole, that is absolutely illegal because we are already past the point where boreholes can be just like drilled randomly. So probably because we compete with them and plants can't run from us, they probably would if they could. I think they are quite endangered. I think arid places are in the brink of extinction in terms of diversity, many of them at least.
Okay, thanks. So there is no evidence from the pollen registry, I can imagine, too early, I suppose, for that.
Yes, the pollen register, it starts becoming a bit flaky in the last century because the sediments, taking the sediments is quite rudimentary, which is like chalk up an aluminium pipe. The sediment is not compact, so sometimes the top, so the last 50 years are lost. But we've got data that are much better than the indirect evidence from the pollen records.
Okay,
and we see
thank
that
you.
we compete.
Sure. Thanks, Saúl.
Oh, you're welcome. That was an extremely good question.
Thanks a lot, Pachi, for that very interesting question. We have another question from Álvaro Dombriz, the president of the Association of Spanish Researchers in South Africa. And he says, if you could please comment on the most urgent risk those landscapes suffer from, both in Spain and South Africa, due to the human actions such as building industries, and how each country is addressing them. Thanks a lot.
Well, this is also a complicated question. So I think that the landscapes, so one typical mind or conceptual frame we understand landscapes is that landscapes will cope with everything until they stop doing so, which means, so we can impact a landscape and there is a certain amount of perturbation a landscape can cope with. So we can extract water and then we can build and then impermeabilize the soil. But there is tipping points that drive massive regime transitions. So for example, if we think of the Karoo, where there's a lot of grazing or livestock grazing is very important, you can graze your shrubs, but there will be a moment that if you just graze everything to the ground, then you're gonna lose the soil and there's gonna be a regime shift from a grazing prone rich ecosystems in terms of ecosystem services and a desert. So in terms of buildings and industries, probably we can't pick up that in the pollen record in a long term because their origin is quite recent. But especially when it comes to water extraction, there is a point where the aquifer level goes so low that the plants can't reach it. And many of the plants we've got in the Western Cape and in Spain, they are phreatophytes, which means they extract water from the phreatic layer. And if they can't reach it, they die. And then we've got a very big erosion problem because deserts are very quick to happen. So once the vegetation cover is lost, the ground becomes loose, and then we lose the upper soil, which is the rich, organic, rich environment. So there's a risk in that. And I think that risk, that desertification risk is extremely real in southern Spain, and it's extremely real in some of the most arid areas in South Africa. How they are addressing it? Well, in Spain, in a bit of a flaky manner, I'd say, because nobody wants to believe that things are going wrong until it is too late. In South Africa, I think there is a very strong role of the farmer as a conservationist, which comes from very old. And it depends on who's managing the land. But I'd say that overall, South Africa is coping better with this kind of, because South Africa still has more income coming from the rural areas, whereas in Spain it's about 12% of the gross interior product. In South Africa it's much higher, so we are not as conscious as they are here. But there is an extremely important role of the farmer as a conservationist in South Africa, which they would treat their field carefully, they would study, and I think South Africa's agriculture is a very scientifically driven activity, whereas in Spain is more, I think, a short-term profit-driven activity. I mean, we can only think of Murcia, where I lived for years, which has the biggest, being one of the arid most areas of the continent, as one of the biggest watering agriculture industries, which is probably delirant.
Thank you very much for that very detailed answer. Alvaro also says thank you. Do we have any other questions?
You're welcome.
I don't see any. Where would you like to go to do research on pollen? What would be another hotspot that you would dream of going to?
Well, that's a good question. So at this point, if it were for me, I would leave South Africa like a gruyere cheese full of holes. I'd take course in every wetland because I think this is such an interesting environment. I think I would go back to southern Spain and also northern Morocco, because northern Morocco is a step farther along the aridification ladder, because they are farther to the south. So probably in Morocco, there has been already ecological transitions that we will see in southern Spain, but we have not yet seen it. So we might be able to pick up flickering signals of warning from the Moroccan landscape that we can afterwards search in Spain and say, well, this happened, you know, a few hundred kilometers to the south. Let's watch out for these things happening here so we can stop them before we reach a tipping point. Probably I'd say that.
So you are going back to Spain, close to Spain.
I like arid places, and we've got a bunch of them there, but I'm happy here.
That's nice. Okay, any other questions from the audience? If I don't see any other questions, I would really like to thank our speaker today, Dr. Saúl Manzano. This was a very nice presentation. It was the second webinar organized by the Association of Spanish Researchers in South Africa and sponsored by the Spanish Embassy in South Africa. And there will be a third webinar, which will take place on the 12th of August at 5, and it will be given by Dr. Irene Esteban, and it will deal with the coastal occupation and foraging during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene at Waterford Bluff, Eastern Pondoland, South Africa. So we would like to see you there. And if we don't have any other questions, I will close this webinar. And thank you very much for attending all. Thank you very much, Saúl.
No, thank you for inviting me.
Okay, then have a nice evening and stay safe.